A girl found 2 puppies, but when they grew up, she got the shock of her life. At first they seemed ordinary, tiny, fragile, helpless. But as they grew, something about them was different, bigger, wilder, smarter, and the bond she felt with them became unbreakable. But that bond came with a price, because someone else wanted them back, someone powerful, someone dangerous, and he would stop at nothing to get them. What started as an act of kindness turned into a battle for survival, with secrets darker than anyone could imagine. These weren't just pets. They were something far more valuable and far more dangerous. Now she must decide, protect the ones she loves, or lose everything. So what exactly were those puppies? And how far would she go when the truth finally came out? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road as Clara Whitlow made her way home from the neighbor's farm. Her worn boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and her empty basket swung gently at her side. She'd just finished trading some of their farm's eggs for Mrs. Henderson's homemade jam, a weekly errand that gave her a brief escape from the endless chores at home. A sudden whimper stopped her in her tracks. Clara tilted her head, listening. There it was again. A soft, pitiful sound coming from behind a cluster of scraggly bushes just off the trail. Her heart picked up speed as she set down her basket and crept closer. The whimpering grew louder. Clara pushed aside the prickly branches, ignoring the way they scratched at her arms. There, huddled together in a shallow depression in the dirt, were 2 tiny creatures. They were so small and dirty that at first glance she thought they were puppies. Their eyes weren't even fully open yet. "Oh, you poor things," Clara whispered, dropping to her knees beside them. They trembled at her voice, pressing closer together. "Who would leave you out here all alone?" She shrugged off her light jacket and gently wrapped it around the shivering pair. Up close, something about them seemed different from regular puppies. Their faces were a bit more pointed, their legs slightly longer, but Clara was too concerned with their immediate well-being to dwell on it. "Don't worry," she murmured, cradling them close to her chest. "I've got you now." The walk home took twice as long with her precious cargo. Clara's mind raced as she walked, knowing what awaited her at the farm. Her father's voice, firm and practical as always, echoed in her head. "We can barely feed ourselves some months, Clara. We don't need any more mouths to feed." The familiar sight of their weathered farmhouse came into view, its paint peeling in the harsh Montana weather. Clara slowed her steps, then stopped completely. The barn. That's where she'd hide them, at least until she could figure out what to do next. She glanced toward the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see her mother kneading bread dough. Her father's truck wasn't in the drive. He was probably still out fixing fences in the north pasture. This was her chance. Clara hurried to the barn, her heart pounding with each step. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and livestock greeted her. Old Bess, their only milk cow, watched with mild interest as Clara climbed up to the hayloft. "This will be perfect," she whispered, creating a small nest in the hay using her jacket. The puppies snuggled into it immediately, their tiny bodies still trembling. "I'll bring you some milk as soon as I can." She ran her fingers gently over their heads, and something inside her chest tightened. These helpless creatures needed her, really needed her, in a way nothing ever had before. At school, she was just the quiet farm girl who sat in the back of the class. At home, she was the reliable daughter who did her chores without complaint, but never quite measured up to her father's expectations. But these puppies? They didn't care that she wasn't the prettiest girl in school or that she sometimes stumbled over her words when speaking in front of others. They just needed someone to care for them, to protect them. Clara crept down from the hayloft and hurried to the house, trying to act normal as she entered through the back door. Her mother looked up from the bread she was shaping. "There you are! Did Mrs. Henderson have the jam ready?" Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh no! I left the basket on the trail! I'll go back and get it right now!" "Clara Marie Whitlow, how could you be so forgetful?" Her mother's voice followed her as she ran back out the door. "Be back before dark!" The guilt of lying to her mother weighed heavy as Clara jogged back to retrieve the basket. She'd never been one for deception. It went against everything her parents had taught her. But the image of those trembling puppies, abandoned and alone, strengthened her resolve. When she returned home, Clara waited until her mother was distracted with dinner preparations before sneaking into the cold storage room. She filled a small jar with milk and grabbed an eyedropper from her mother's sewing kit. She'd seen Mrs. Henderson use something similar to feed orphaned lambs last spring. Back in the barn, Clara climbed carefully up to the hayloft, balancing her supplies. The puppies were right where she'd left them, curled together in their makeshift nest. They stirred at her approach, making tiny snuffling sounds that tugged at her heart. "Okay, little ones," she whispered, settling down beside them. "Let's see if you're hungry." It took some trial and error, but soon both puppies were eagerly accepting drops of milk from the eyedropper. As she fed them, Clara studied them more closely. Their fur was a mottled grey-brown, and there was something about the shape of their ears and the set of their shoulders that didn't quite match any dog breed she knew. But it didn't matter. They were hers to protect now. "I should give you names," she said softly, watching as they drifted off to sleep, their bellies full. "How about Shadow and Storm?" "Because I found you in the shadows, and you're as grey as storm clouds." The sound of a truck engine made her freeze. Her father was home. Clara quickly hid the milk jar and eyedropper behind some hay bales and made sure the puppies were well concealed before climbing down. She slipped out of the barn just as her father's truck pulled up. He stepped out, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the setting sun. "Evening, Papa," she called, trying to sound casual. He nodded, his eyes tracking from her to the barn. "What were you doing in there so late?" "Just checking on old Bess," Clara said, the lie bitter on her tongue. She seemed a little restless earlier. Her father's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd always been able to tell when she wasn't being entirely truthful. But after a moment, he just nodded again. "Well, come on in. Your mama's got dinner ready." That night, Clara barely tasted her food. Her thoughts kept drifting to the barn, to her secret charges hidden in the hay. As soon as the dishes were done, she begged off to bed early, claiming she had a headache. Instead of going to her room, though, Clara snuck back out to the barn. The night was cool, and crickets chirped in the darkness as she made her way across the yard, her flashlight beam bouncing ahead of her. In the hayloft, Shadow and Storm were awake and hungry again. As Clara fed them their midnight meal, she whispered promises in the darkness. "I won't let anything happen to you," she said, her voice fierce with determination. "I don't care what anyone says. You're not worthless. You're mine now, and I'm going to take care of you." The puppies snuggled against her, their tiny bodies warm and trusting. In that moment, Clara felt stronger than she ever had before. She might be just a quiet farm girl, overlooked and underestimated, but she had found something worth fighting for. As she crept back to the house later, Clara knew this was just the beginning. Keeping the puppies hidden wouldn't be easy. She'd have to be clever, careful, and brave, braver than she'd ever been before. But looking back at the dark shape of the barn, she felt no regret, only determination. For the first time in her life, Clara Whitlow had chosen to stand up for something, to protect what others might deem worthless. And in doing so, she'd taken the first step toward discovering her own strength. The Montana winter melted into spring, and with it came changes Clara could hardly believe. Shadow and Storm weren't growing like normal puppies. They were transforming at an alarming rate. By March, they were already the size of full-grown German shepherds, their frames powerful and muscular. Clara measured out their food carefully, sneaking extra portions from the livestock feed and supplementing it with scraps from the kitchen. But even she couldn't deny that keeping them hidden was becoming nearly impossible. The hayloft that had once seemed like a perfect sanctuary now felt cramped for the massive animals. One crisp morning, while her parents were in town for supplies, Clara decided to let them stretch their legs. She led them down from the loft, watching as they moved with an eerie grace that seemed almost supernatural. Their golden eyes took in everything, alert and intelligent in a way that made her shiver. "Come on, boys," she whispered, guiding them toward the back pasture. "But remember, quiet now." They understood. They always understood. That was another thing that amazed her, how they seemed to grasp not just words, but intentions. Shadow and Storm moved silently beside her, their huge paws making barely a sound on the damp grass. The spring air was sharp and clean as they reached the pasture fence. Clara checked one last time to make sure no one was around, then let them run. They exploded into motion, powerful bodies stretching out as they raced across the field. They weren't just fast, they were magnificent. A truck engine in the distance made Clara's heart jump. She whistled softly, and immediately both animals turned, racing back to her side. As they disappeared into the barn, Clara caught sight of Dean Kettering's old pickup rolling down the dirt road. Dean was different from most folks around here. At 23, he worked various ranch jobs in the area, and unlike others, he never seemed to look down on Clara for being young or quiet. He pulled up now, killing the engine. "Morning, Clara," he called, stepping out. His eyes flickered to the barn. "Thought I saw something out here. Big animals?" Clara's throat went dry. "Just checking the fence line." Dean studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You know, my grandpa used to tell stories about the old wolves that used to roam these parts. Said they were something special, not like regular wolves at all." Clara's heart pounded. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do." His voice was gentle. "I've seen them before, you know. Not close up, but enough to know they're not regular dogs. And I've seen how careful you are with them." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. "Are you going to tell someone?" Dean shook his head. "Number, but you should know. People are starting to talk. Mrs. Henderson saw them last week when you had them out. Called them monsters." The word hit Clara like a physical blow. "They're not monsters. They're gentle and smart and—" "Hey," Dean cut in softly. "I believe you, but not everyone's going to understand." As if on cue, a group of teenagers from Clara's school drove past in a beat-up Chevy. "Hey, Whitlow!" one of them yelled. "How are your pet monsters doing?" "Still hiding them away like the freak you are." The truck roared past, leaving a cloud of dust and mocking laughter. Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation. Dean's hand settled on her shoulder. "Don't let them get to you. Some people are scared of what they don't understand." Inside the barn, Clara could hear low growls. Shadow and Storm had heard the taunts, and their protective instincts were roaring to life. She hurried inside, Dean following cautiously. The wolves stood alert, their massive forms casting long shadows in the barn's dimness. But when they saw Clara, their posture softened. They moved to her side, pressing against her legs like oversized guard dogs. Dean let out a low whistle. "They're incredible." Clara ran her hands through their thick fur, drawing comfort from their solid presence. "They understand everything. Sometimes I think they know what I'm feeling before I do." "I believe it." Dean crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. "My grandpa's stories. He said the old wolves had a special connection with certain people, a bond that went deeper than anything normal." Shadow and Storm watched Dean with intelligent eyes, neither aggressive nor friendly, waiting for Clara's lead. She felt a surge of love for them so strong it almost hurt. "I found them when everyone else had thrown them away," she said quietly. "They were supposed to be weak, worthless. But look at them now." Dean stood slowly. "They're like you in that way. People around here, they don't see what's special about you either. But these two do." He gestured to the wolves. "And so do I." Clara blinked back tears, touched by his words. The wolves pressed closer, offering silent support. Their loyalty was absolute, their love unconditional. In that moment, Clara knew with complete certainty that saving them had been more than just an act of kindness. It had been destiny. The sound of another vehicle approaching made them all tense. The wolves melted back into the shadows with uncanny stealth, while Dean headed for his truck. "Be careful, Clara," he said before leaving. "But don't let anyone make you ashamed of who you are, or who they are. Sometimes the things people call monsters are actually protectors in disguise." Clara watched him drive away, his words echoing in her mind. Shadow and Storm emerged from their hiding place, their golden eyes fixed on her with unwavering devotion. She reached out to touch them, feeling the strength in their powerful frames, the intelligence in their steady gaze. They weren't just pets anymore, they were part of her soul, and no amount of mockery or fear from others could change that truth. The autumn morning stretched crisp and clear across the Montana landscape. Clara breathed in deeply, savoring the sharp scent of pine needles as she hiked along the worn trail that marked the edge of her family's property. Shadow and Storm loped easily beside her, their massive forms moving with fluid grace through the underbrush. "Just a little further," she said softly, more to herself than to them. The wolves' ears twitched at her voice, but they maintained their steady pace. Their size still amazed her. In the months since she'd found them, they'd grown larger than any dog she'd ever seen. Their shoulders now reached her waist, and their golden eyes held an intelligence that sometimes made her shiver. The sound of voices ahead made Clara freeze. The wolves instantly tensed, their hackles rising as low growls rumbled in their chests. "Quiet," she whispered, crouching down. Shadow and Storm immediately went silent, but their bodies remained coiled with tension. Through the trees, Clara could make out two men she didn't recognize. They carried rifles and wore orange hunting vests, but this was private property. They had no right to be here. Her heart began to pound as she realized how isolated they were. She started to back away slowly, hoping to retreat unnoticed. But a twig snapped under her foot, and both men whirled around. "Well, what do we have here?" The taller man's voice was rough, unfriendly. His eyes narrowed as he took in Clara and the wolves. "Those some kind of dogs you got there, girl?" Clara's mouth went dry. "This is private property. You need to leave." The shorter man laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Private property? Ain't seen no signs. Besides, we tracked a deer this way. Don't much care about property lines when we're hunting." They began moving closer, their rifles held casually but ready. Clara's pulse roared in her ears as she backed away. "I'm serious. You need to go." "Or what?" The tall man's smile turned ugly. "You gonna make us? You and your mutts?" Shadow and Storm moved forward, positioning themselves between Clara and the men. Their earlier growls returned, deeper now, filled with deadly promise. The sound made the hair on Clara's neck stand up. The shorter man raised his rifle slightly. "Better call off your dogs, girl, before something unfortunate happens." "They're not dogs," Clara said, her voice shaking. "And if you hurt them, You'll what?" The tall man took another step forward, and that was when everything exploded into motion. Shadow launched himself at the tall man with frightening speed, while Storm went for the other hunter. The men shouted in shock and fear as nearly 200 pounds of snarling wolf slammed into them. Rifles went flying as they hit the ground. Clara watched in stunned horror as her gentle companions transformed into something ancient and terrifying. They didn't bite, but their power was overwhelming as they pinned the men down, teeth bared inches from their throats. The hunters' faces went pale with terror as they stared into those intelligent golden eyes. "Call them off!" the shorter man screamed. "Please!" "Get up slowly," Clara commanded, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Leave your rifles, and if I ever see you on our property again—" She didn't need to finish the threat. The moment the wolves backed off, the men scrambled to their feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Their abandoned rifles lay in the dirt like discarded toys. Clara's legs gave out and she sank to the ground, shaking. Immediately, Shadow and Storm were beside her, their savage fury replaced by gentle concern. They pressed against her, offering warmth and comfort, their tongues softly licking her trembling hands. "Good boys," she whispered. "Such good boys." Looking into their eyes now, she saw something that both thrilled and frightened her. These weren't just oversized dogs, or even ordinary wolves. There was an ancient power in them, something wild and fierce and protective. They had chosen her, and they would defend her with everything they had. The walk home was tense, Clara jumping at every sound while the wolves remained vigilant. When they finally reached the farmhouse, her father was waiting on the porch. One look at her face told him something had happened. "Clara." His voice was sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" She told him everything, watching his face grow grimmer with each word. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring at the wolves who lay calmly at Clara's feet. "You know this is going to cause trouble," he finally said. "Word will spread. People don't like feeling afraid. And those men, they're going to talk." "They were trespassing," Clara protested. "The wolves were protecting me." "That's exactly what worries me." Her father ran a hand through his graying hair. "They're capable of violence, Clara, real violence. Maybe you think you can control them, but what happens if you can't?" Shadow and Storm watched the exchange with unblinking eyes, their loyalty to Clara evident in every line of their bodies. But her father's words planted a seed of uncertainty in her mind. Just how powerful were they? And what would happen when others came looking for them, as she knew they eventually would? Raymond Garrick sat in his leather chair, fingers drumming against the polished mahogany desk as he listened to the hunter's story. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, illuminating the mounted animal heads that decorated the walls of his ranch house. "And you're certain about what you saw?" Garrick's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath the velvet. 2 grey wolves, unusually large. The shorter hunter, Miller, nodded eagerly. "Biggest I've ever seen, Mr. Garrick. But they weren't just wolves, something different about them, their faces, the way they moved, and their eyes. Golden, like something out of a nightmare. They were protecting some girl," the taller one, Jenkins, added. "Farm kid, looked about 15 or so, had them trained somehow." Garrick's drumming fingers stopped. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages filled with careful notes and diagrams. "This farm. Where exactly?" "Whitlow Place, just past Miller's Creek. Been there forever, but they're barely hanging on from what I hear." Garrick flipped through the journal until he found what he was looking for. Breeding records from 5 years ago. His eyes narrowed as he read the faded entries. Golden eyes, grey coat, accelerated growth rate. He looked up sharply. "Did either of you notice any markings? A white patch on the chest, perhaps?" Miller's face paled. "Yeah, both of them had it, like a diamond shape." Garrick closed the journal with deliberate care. 5 years ago, he'd ordered 2 defective pups from his experimental breeding program to be disposed of. They'd been part of his attempt to create the perfect hunting companion, wolves with enhanced size, strength, and intelligence, but complete loyalty to their handler. The program had cost millions in bribes and hidden facilities before he'd been forced to shut it down. Those pups should have died of exposure. Instead, they'd survived. Thrived, even. And now they were bonded to some insignificant farm girl. "Mr. Garrick?" Jenkins shifted nervously. "About our payment." Garrick waved a hand dismissively, and his assistant stepped forward to handle the men. Once they were gone, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the vast Montana landscape he'd spent decades acquiring, piece by piece. "Send Blake and Thompson," he told his assistant. "Tell them to observe only. I want to know everything about this girl and my wolves." Over the next few days, Clara noticed small changes around the farm. Unfamiliar trucks driving past more slowly than usual. Strange men at the general store asking casual questions about local families. She tried to dismiss her unease, but Shadow and Storm grew increasingly agitated, their hackles rising at the slightest unusual sound. One evening, as Clara finished brushing Storm's thick coat in the barn, she heard voices outside. The wolves' heads snapped up, alert and wary. "Easy," she whispered, moving to the barn door. Through a gap in the weathered wood, she saw two men talking to her father near the house. They wore expensive boots and jackets that seemed out of place on a small farm. "Just asking about the property, Mr. Whitlow," one was saying. "Our employer has an interest in expanding his holdings in this area." Her father's response was firm. "Not interested in selling. Never have been, never will be." "Times are tough," the other man said smoothly. "Banks aren't kind to struggling farmers these days. Might be worth considering an offer, especially with a daughter to think about." Clara's hands clenched into fists. Shadow pressed against her leg, a low rumble building in his chest. She placed a calming hand on his head, though her own heart was racing. "I think you should leave," her father said. The men's polite masks slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. They left without argument, but Clara watched them survey the property as they walked to their truck, taking note of everything. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Shadow and Storm kept vigil by her window. Something was happening. Something bigger than trespassing hunters or nosy strangers. The wolves felt it too. Their usual playful nature had been replaced by a constant watchfulness. The next morning, Clara walked into town to pick up supplies. As she passed the diner, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her stop. Garrick's men asking around again, buying up everything he can get his hands on. Heard what happened to the Hendersons when they refused to sell. She'd heard the name Garrick before. Everyone in the county had. Raymond Garrick owned more land than anyone else in 3 counties, and his reputation for getting what he wanted was legendary. But why would he be interested in their small, struggling farm? As she walked home, pieces began falling into place. The hunters, the strange men, the questions about the wolves. Someone was watching them, but why? The answer came that afternoon. Clara was doing her homework on the porch when a sleek black car pulled up to the house. The man who stepped out carried himself with the confidence of someone used to power. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his clothes impeccable despite the dusty surroundings. Shadow and Storm emerged from the barn, moving with deadly grace to flank Clara as she stood. The man's eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made her skin crawl. There was recognition in that gaze, and ownership. "Remarkable," Raymond Garrick said softly. "They've grown even more impressive than I'd hoped." Clara's world tilted sideways as understanding dawned. This man knew her wolves, knew what they were, and from the way he looked at them, like valuable possessions rather than living creatures, she realized he was the one who had abandoned them to die all those years ago. Shadow and Storm pressed closer to Clara, their bodies tense with barely contained aggression. They remembered too. "Who are you?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Garrick smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a man with an interest in exceptional creatures. Your wolves and I have a history, my dear. One I think it's time to discuss." The black car's tires crunched on gravel as it pulled away, leaving Clara shaken on the porch. Shadow and Storm hadn't relaxed their protective stance, their golden eyes tracking Garrick's departure until the dust settled behind his vehicle. That evening, Clara could barely touch her dinner. Her mother noticed her pushing food around her plate. "Everything all right, honey?" she asked, reaching across to feel Clara's forehead. Before Clara could answer, heavy knocking rattled the front door. Her father rose from his chair, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Dad, wait!" The knocking came again, more insistent. Through the window, Clara spotted 3 large men on their porch. They weren't the same ones from before. These looked rougher, meaner. Her father opened the door just enough to block the entrance with his body. Can I help you? Mr. Whitlow, the largest man said, his voice gravelly. We're here about the wolf dogs your daughter's been keeping. Mr. Garrick wants them returned to his breeding program. Clara's mother gasped. Her father's shoulders stiffened. Those animals are my daughter's. They were abandoned as pups. They're valuable hybrid stock. Another man cut in. Worth a lot of money. Mr. Garrick's willing to be generous. $20,000 for their return. Clara stood up so quickly her chair crashed backward. No, you can't have them. The first man's face hardened. Listen, girl, those aren't pets. They're dangerous animals that belong to Mr. Garrick's program. You're lucky he's offering payment instead of pressing charges for theft. Theft? Clara's father barked. You left them to die by the road. Final offer, the man said. Take the money, or things might get difficult for your family. Clara felt ice in her veins, but her voice came out steady. Those wolves chose me. They trust me. I won't let you take them back to be abused. The men exchanged dark looks. The leader pointed at Clara. You've got until midnight to change your mind. After that, don't say we didn't warn you. They left, their threats hanging in the air like smoke. Clara's parents tried to convince her to accept the money, to avoid making an enemy of someone like Garrick. But she wouldn't betray Shadow and Storm. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat in the barn with the wolves, their massive forms providing comfort as she stroked their thick fur. Around 11, she heard vehicles approaching. Shadow's ears pricked up first, then came the smell of gasoline. Clara barely had time to react before flames erupted along the barn's outer wall. The dry wood caught instantly. Smoke poured in through the gaps in the planks. Dad! She screamed. Fire! Her father had been checking the property, worried about exactly this. He came running from behind the house, garden hose in hand, but it was useless against the inferno. The flames were spreading too fast. Shadow and Storm burst out of the barn, Clara between them. Through the smoke, she saw several figures retreating to their vehicles. Her father was trying to reach the tractor, hoping to pull it clear of the fire. That's when part of the burning roof collapsed. Clara screamed as her father disappeared under a shower of sparks and burning timber. Without hesitation, Shadow and Storm bounded forward. Clara watched in terror as they plunged into the flames. Moments later, they emerged, dragging her father by his jacket. His face was smudged with soot, but he was conscious, coughing and staring at the wolves with disbelief. The fire department arrived too late to save the barn, but managed to keep the flames from spreading to the house. As they worked, Clara huddled with her parents, watching their livelihood burn. Shadow and Storm stood guard, their fur singed, but their posture alert for any returning threats. The sheriff came to take their statement, but Clara could tell by his nervous glances at Garrick's name that no real investigation would follow. Her father's hands were bandaged for minor burns, but thanks to the wolves, he'd escaped serious injury. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, Clara realized everything had changed. This wasn't about keeping unusual pets anymore. Garrick had shown he would destroy anything, or anyone, in his way. She looked at Shadow and Storm, their golden eyes reflecting the rising sun. They had chosen her once, as abandoned pups. Now she chose them again, knowing it meant war with a man who crushed people as easily as stepping on ants. Her father touched her shoulder, his voice rough from smoke. Clara, those wolves, they saved my life. I know, Dad. She straightened her shoulders, feeling stronger despite her exhaustion. And now we have to save theirs. The wolves pressed against her legs, their presence solid and reassuring. Clara had always been the quiet one, the overlooked one. But Garrick had just made a terrible mistake. He thought she would break easily. Instead, he had started a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose, and two powerful protectors at her side. Shadow lifted his head and howled, a sound of defiance and strength. Storm joined in, their voices twining together in the smoky air. Clara felt the vibration in her bones and knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning after the barn burning, Clara sat at her kitchen table with Dean, her hands wrapped around a mug of cooling coffee. Shadow and Storm lay at her feet, their massive forms providing silent comfort. "There's got to be proof somewhere," Dean said, his voice low and urgent. "A guy like Garrick, moving that many animals, he's got to keep records." Clara nodded slowly. Those men knew exactly what Shadow and Storm were, called them program animals. She glanced down at the wolves. "Whatever Garrick's doing, it's bigger than just 2 abandoned puppies." Dean leaned forward, his weathered cowboy hat casting shadows across his face. "I've been asking around. Garrick's got a storage facility out by the old Miller place. Real secure. Cameras, guards, the works. Why would someone need that much security for simple storage?" "We need to see what's in there," Clara said, her quiet voice firm. Dean's eyes widened. "That's breaking and entering, Clara. Serious trouble if we're caught. More trouble than burning down our barn." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "They almost killed my dad, Dean. And they'll keep coming unless we find something to stop them." Dean studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I know the night guard's schedule. Takes his dinner break around midnight, walks the perimeter twice, gives us maybe 20 minutes. They spent the next few days preparing." Dean scouted the facility, noting camera positions and guard patterns. Clara practiced with Shadow and Storm, teaching them hand signals for silence and stillness. The wolves seemed to understand the gravity of their mission, responding to her commands with uncanny precision. On the chosen night, Clara waited until her parents were asleep before slipping out. She met Dean at the edge of their property, the wolves ghosting silently beside her through the darkness. The storage facility loomed ahead, a collection of metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. "Guard just started his break," Dean whispered, checking his watch. "Loading dock on the east side has a blind spot in the camera coverage." They moved carefully through the shadows, the wolves perfectly silent despite their size. Dean produced a set of bolt cutters, making quick work of the padlock on a side gate. Clara's heart thundered in her chest as they slipped inside. The loading dock door had an electronic keypad. Dean pulled out a small UV light, revealing fingerprints on 4 numbers. "Most people don't change their codes often enough," he muttered, trying combinations until the lock clicked open. Inside, the facility was a maze of metal storage units and wooden crates. Some were marked with shipping labels in foreign languages. Others bore warning symbols for live cargo. The air smelled of sawdust and something else, something wild. "Here," Dean whispered, pointing to an office door. "Records would be in there." The door was locked, but Dean made quick work of it with a credit card and steady hands. Clara stood watch while he searched the filing cabinets, Shadow and Storm alert at her sides. "Clara!" Dean's voice was tight with shock. "You need to see this." She joined him at the desk where he'd spread out several folders. Shipping manifests, veterinary records, breeding charts, all documenting an operation far larger than she'd imagined. Wolves, big cats, exotic birds, even bears, all being bred and sold illegally across state lines and international borders. "Look at these prices," Dean breathed. "Hundreds of thousands per animal. Garrick's making millions." Clara's hands shook as she read through the documents. Many animals were listed as terminated for being too aggressive or not meeting buyer specifications. Shadow and Storm had been marked the same way, scheduled for destruction before they escaped. "We need copies," she said, pulling out her phone. She photographed page after page while Dean kept watch. A sudden noise outside made them freeze. Footsteps approached. "Guards back early," Dean hissed. They quickly replaced the files and slipped out of the office. The footsteps grew closer. Clara signaled the wolves to stay low as they crept between rows of crates. A flashlight beam swept across the floor ahead. Something moved inside one of the crates. A low growl emerged, followed by others. Whatever animals were imprisoned here, they sensed the wolves' presence. The sounds grew louder, threatening to give away their position. Shadow and Storm remained perfectly still, but their muscles were tense. Clara could feel their desire to respond to the caged animals. The guard's footsteps stopped. The flashlight beam swung closer. Dean grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her behind a stack of empty crates. The wolves followed, pressing against them in the narrow space. Clara held her breath as the guard passed within feet of their hiding spot. For one terrible moment, the flashlight beam illuminated the crates directly above them. But the guard moved on, muttering into his radio about checking the perimeter. They waited until his footsteps faded before making their way back to the loading dock. Every step felt agonizingly slow, but they couldn't risk running and making noise. The caged animals had gone quiet again, as if understanding the need for secrecy. Finally, they slipped out into the cool night air. They didn't speak until they were well away from the facility, hidden in the safety of a grove of trees. "This is huge," Dean said, still breathing hard from their escape. "These records prove everything. The illegal breeding, the animal trafficking, all of it." Clara nodded, her mind racing. "But who do we take it to? The local sheriff won't touch Garrick. We need someone bigger." "I know someone," Dean said. "My cousin works for the state wildlife department. She's been trying to build a case against illegal animal trafficking for years. This could be exactly what she needs." Clara looked at Shadow and Storm, their golden eyes reflecting the moonlight. "All those animals in there, they're suffering like you would have." The wolves pressed closer, as if understanding. "We're going to stop him, not just for us now, but for all of them." Dean touched her shoulder gently. "This won't be easy, Clara. Garrick's got money, connections. He'll fight back hard." "I know." She straightened her shoulders, feeling stronger despite her fear. "But he doesn't understand what he's fighting. He thinks money and power are everything. But there are stronger things. Loyalty, justice, the bond between beings who choose to protect each other." Shadow and Storm lifted their heads in silent agreement. The wolves who had once been marked for death now stood ready to bring down the man who had condemned them. Clara felt the weight of the evidence on her phone, and with it, the responsibility to act. The night wind carried the distant sounds of the imprisoned animals. Their cries would not go unanswered. Clara had started this journey to save 2 abandoned puppies, but now she understood her true purpose. It wasn't just about protecting her wolves anymore. It was about bringing light to the darkness Garrick had built his empire upon. The storm had been building all afternoon, dark clouds gathering like bruises across the Montana sky. Clara and Dean were walking the fence line of her family's property, checking for signs of Garrick's men, when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. "We should head back," Dean said, pulling his jacket collar up against the wind. "This is going to get ugly fast." Clara nodded, but something made her hesitate. Shadow and Storm were acting strange, their ears pricked forward, bodies tense. They'd been extra vigilant since the night at Garrick's facility, as if sensing the growing danger. Thunder rolled overhead, and the rain intensified. Within minutes, the dirt road had turned to mud, making each step treacherous. The wolves moved closer, flanking Clara and Dean protectively. The first shot cracked through the air like lightning. Shadow leaped forward with a snarl as dark figures emerged from the tree line. Clara counted at least 6 men, all carrying rifles. They'd been waiting, using the storm as cover. "Run!" Dean shouted, shoving Clara toward the barn. But the mud was too slick. She stumbled, going down hard on her hands and knees. Storm rushed to defend her, while Shadow engaged the attackers. The massive wolf's fury was terrifying to behold. He knocked one man down, sending his rifle flying. But there were too many. Another shot rang out, and Clara screamed as Storm yelped in pain. A tranquilizer dart protruded from his shoulder. Dean tried to reach them, but 2 men tackled him into the mud. Clara watched in horror as Storm's movements became sluggish. The proud wolf struggled to stay standing, golden eyes fixing on Clara with desperate loyalty. "No!" she screamed as more men surrounded Storm. They threw a heavy net over him, forcing him down. The wolf fought with what strength remained, but the tranquilizer was too powerful. Shadow tried to break through to his brother, but rifle butts and kicks drove him back. Blood matted his grey fur where someone had struck him. Clara had never seen such savagery directed at an animal. "Cage him!" a harsh voice ordered. Through the curtain of rain, Clara recognized Marcus Fletcher, Garrick's head of security. He stood watching with cold satisfaction as his men dragged Storm's unconscious body toward a waiting truck. Clara fought to her feet, mud coating her clothes. "Please, you're hurting him!" She tried to run forward, but rough hands grabbed her arms, holding her back. "Mr. Garrick sends his regards," Fletcher said, walking closer. Rain streamed down his face, but his eyes remained cruel and dry. "He suggests you reconsider his generous offer to buy the animals. Otherwise—" He gestured at Storm's limp form being loaded into a steel cage. "Accidents happen." Dean was still struggling with his captors. "You won't get away with this," he shouted. "We have evidence." Fletcher's boot caught Dean in the stomach, doubling him over. "Evidence can disappear," he said calmly, "just like people." Clara felt something inside her crack. The sight of Storm, her proud, beautiful protector, lying helpless in that cage, broke something fundamental in her world. All her determination, all her righteous anger seemed suddenly childish and small against the brutal reality of power. Shadow pressed against her leg, trembling with rage and fear for his brother, but even he seemed diminished now, outnumbered and outgunned. 24 hours, Fletcher said. "Bring the other wolf to the old Wilson property. Mr. Garrick will be generous if you cooperate." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "If not, well, these animals can be difficult to control. Sometimes they have to be put down." The truck's engine roared to life. Clara watched through tears as they drove away with Storm, taking a piece of her heart with them. The rain continued to fall, cold and relentless, but she barely felt it. How could she have been so naive? She was just a girl, a nobody from a struggling farm. What chance did she ever have against men like Garrick? Dean limped to her side, holding his ribs where Fletcher had kicked him. "Clara," he said softly, "we'll find a way." But she couldn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the muddy road where the truck had disappeared. Shadow whined, pressing closer, but even his warmth couldn't penetrate the cold emptiness spreading through her chest. The storm raged on, matching the devastation in her heart. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd believed in, seemed to wash away with the rain. In trying to protect those she loved, she'd only brought them more pain. Thunder cracked overhead, and Clara flinched. The sound reminded her of the gunshots, of Storm's yelp of pain. She could still see his eyes, fighting to stay focused on her, even as the tranquilizer took hold. He'd trusted her to protect him, and she'd failed. "We should get inside," Dean said, touching her shoulder gently. But Clara couldn't move. Her legs felt rooted in the mud, as if letting go of this spot would mean truly accepting what had happened. Shadow nudged her hand, leaving a wet nose print on her palm. His golden eyes held the same question she couldn't answer. How could they save Storm? How could they possibly stand against the machinery of wealth and power that Garrick commanded? The rain plastered her hair to her face, mixing with tears she couldn't stop. She was 15 years old, mud-covered and beaten, watching everything she cared about being torn away. The evidence on her phone seemed worthless now. What good were pictures and documents against men with guns? Against the casual cruelty of those who saw living beings as nothing but commodities to be bought and sold? Dean tried again to guide her toward shelter, but Clara shook her head. She couldn't leave this spot, couldn't face going inside where Storm's absence would be even more apparent. The empty space beside her felt like a physical wound. Shadow threw back his head and howled, a sound of such pure anguish that it cut through even the storm's fury. The cry echoed across the rain-swept fields, carrying all the pain and fear Clara couldn't voice. It was the sound of family torn apart, of trust betrayed, of power crushing innocence beneath its heel. And in that moment, standing in the mud with Shadow's grief-stricken howl filling the air, Clara felt smaller, and more helpless than she ever had before. The world had shown its teeth, and she had discovered just how sharp they were. The storm continued to rage, indifferent to the broken hearts beneath its clouds. Clara stood motionless, letting the rain wash over her, wondering how she could have ever believed that love and determination would be enough to change the world. Shadow's howl faded into the thunder, leaving only the sound of rain and the hollow echo of defeat. The kitchen clock ticked away in the silence, marking each moment Storm remained in Garrick's clutches. Clara sat at the worn wooden table, staring blankly at her untouched mug of hot chocolate. Shadow lay at her feet, his massive head resting on her mud-caked boots. "I have to give him up." Her voice cracked. "I can't let them hurt Storm." Dean, who had been pacing by the window, stopped abruptly. "No." The firmness in his voice made Clara look up. "That's exactly what Garrick wants, to break you down piece by piece." "But what choice do we have?" Clara's hands trembled around the mug. "You saw what they did. They have guns, money, everything. I'm just—" She gestured helplessly at herself. "Me." Dean pulled out a chair, its legs scraping against the linoleum. He sat down, leaning forward with an intensity Clara had never seen before. "You're not just anything, Clara Whitlow. You're the girl who stood up to an entire town when they mocked your wolves. You're the one who broke into Garrick's facility to uncover the truth. You've got more courage than any of his thugs." Clara shook her head, but Dean wasn't finished. "Remember what we found in those files? The auction details?" "Yeah," Clara said quietly. "This Saturday, Garrick's showing off his special breeds to buyers from all over." "Exactly." Dean pulled out his phone, opening the photos they'd taken of the documents. "It's the perfect time to strike. Security will be spread thin dealing with all the guests, and we have something Garrick doesn't expect." "What's that?" "Shadow." Dean gestured to the wolf, who lifted his head at the sound of his name. "He can track Storm's scent better than any security system. And more importantly," he met Clara's eyes, "we have the truth. All those photos and videos we took, one call to the right authorities during the auction, and Garrick's empire comes crashing down." Clara felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in her chest. "But how would we even get in? The estate will be crawling with guards." A small smile crossed Dean's face. "Remember my cousin Mark, the one who works for the catering company?" Clara's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The auction's catering staff could use a couple extra hands for such a big event." Dean nodded. "Mark owes me a favor. He can get us in as servers." For the first time since Storm's capture, Clara felt her mind beginning to work again, planning instead of just reacting. "We'd need to coordinate everything perfectly. The timing, the evidence, the escape route." "Then let's plan it." Dean pulled out a notebook and pen. "Step by step. No detail too small." They worked through the night, mapping out every aspect of their mission. Clara's kitchen table became their war room, covered in sketched layouts and timeline notes. Shadow watched them intently, as if understanding the gravity of their plotting. "The main ballroom here," Dean marked an X on their rough diagram, "is where the auction will take place. But knowing Garrick, he'll keep the animals somewhere separate until they're brought out for display. The kennels." Clara pointed to a building on the estate map they'd photographed. "That's where Storm will be. Shadow can confirm it once we're inside." She ran her fingers through her wolf's thick fur. "Can't you, boy?" Shadow's tail thumped against the floor in response. As dawn approached, their plan took shape. Clara felt her resolve hardening with each detail they nailed down. This wasn't just about her wolves anymore. It was about stopping Garrick from hurting any more animals, from destroying any more lives with his greed. "We'll need to practice," Dean said, stifling a yawn. "The serving part has to look natural, and we need to memorize every exit, every corridor." Clara nodded, determination replacing her earlier despair. "I'll contact that wildlife officer, the one who gave me her card after the Hunters incident. She said to call if I ever needed help." "Perfect." Dean gathered their notes. "We have 3 days, That's enough time to get ready if we work fast. Clara stood, stretching her stiff muscles. Shadow rose with her, pressing against her leg. She scratched behind his ears, feeling the steady strength in his presence. "We're coming for your brother," she whispered, "and this time we're taking Garrick down for good." They spent the next day in careful preparation. Dean's cousin Mark got them the catering uniforms and basic layout of the service areas. Clara memorized the staff protocols, while Dean worked out the timing of shift changes and security patrols. In the barn, they practiced their roles. Clara learned to balance a serving tray, to move efficiently through crowded spaces. Dean taught her the subtle signs servers use to communicate across a room. Shadow watched it all, occasionally helping them rehearse different scenarios. "The key," Dean explained as Clara practiced her server's smile, "is to be invisible. Rich people look right through the help. Use that." Clara nodded, remembering all the times she'd felt invisible herself. For once, being overlooked will work in our favor. They tested Shadow's tracking abilities, hiding items with Storm's scent around the property. The wolf found each one without hesitation, moving with a stealth that belied his size. Clara felt a surge of pride watching him work. These weren't just animals, they were partners, every bit as invested in this mission as she was. As evening fell on their second day of preparation, Clara sat with Shadow on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fierce oranges and reds. Dean joined them, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Nervous?" he asked, handing her one. Clara considered the question. "Yes," she admitted, "but not like before. This isn't about being scared anymore. It's about doing what's right." Dean nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just a quiet farm kid. But there's steel in you, Clara Whitlow. The kind that doesn't break when life gets hard. It gets stronger." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "I couldn't do this without you," she said softly. "Both of you." She included Shadow in her glance. "Sure you could." Dean smiled. "But I'm glad you don't have to." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade. Clara thought about Storm, alone in Garrick's kennels, and felt her determination solidify into something unshakable. She wasn't the same girl who had found 2 trembling puppies on a back road. She had grown, just like her wolves, into something stronger than anyone had expected. The next morning, they made their final preparations. Clara called the wildlife officer, carefully explaining what they had discovered about Garrick's operation. The officer promised to have a team ready to move on their signal. Dean arrived with their uniforms and final instructions from Mark. They went over the plan one last time, checking every detail. Shadow would stay hidden in Dean's truck until they could slip him onto the grounds through the service entrance. Once inside, they would use the chaos of the auction to their advantage. "Remember," Dean said as they finished their review, "we're not just trying to save Storm. We're shutting down Garrick's whole operation. Everything we've learned, everything we've documented, it all comes together tomorrow." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of their mission. But it no longer felt crushing. Instead, it steadied her, gave her purpose. She thought of all the animals in Garrick's kennels, all the lives treated as commodities. She thought of Storm's trust in her, of Shadow's unwavering loyalty, of Dean's quiet strength beside her. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice firm with conviction, "we end this." Shadow pressed against her leg, his presence a reminder of everything they were fighting for. Clara scratched his ears, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. She wasn't just acting out of desperation anymore. This was a calculated strike against cruelty and greed, planned with care and executed with purpose. In her pocket, she felt the weight of her phone with its damning evidence. In her mind, she reviewed their carefully crafted plan. And in her heart, she held the image of Storm, waiting for rescue. She was ready. The quiet farm kitchen, scene of so many doubts and fears, now felt charged with purpose. Clara looked at Dean, at Shadow, at their scattered notes and plans. They were an unlikely team, a teenage girl, a young ranch hand, and a wolf. But together, They had found the strength to stand against seemingly impossible odds. Tomorrow would test everything they had prepared for, but Clara felt oddly calm. The time for fear had passed. Now there was only the mission ahead, and her absolute determination to see it through. The marble floors of Garrick's mansion echoed under Clara's sensible black shoes as she balanced a tray of champagne flutes. Wealthy guests in evening wear milled about, their jewelry catching the light from crystal chandeliers. Dean, also in server's black, caught her eye from across the room and gave an imperceptible nod. Clara's heart hammered beneath her crisp white shirt as she threaded through the crowd. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Shadow waiting in the shadows of the manicured gardens. She checked her watch, 15 minutes until the auction began. "Remember to smile," a senior server hissed as she passed. Clara quickly plastered on a vacant expression, remembering Dean's advice about being invisible. She made her way toward the kennels, counting her steps to stay calm. The underground facility was state-of-the-art, climate-controlled spaces filled with exotic creatures. Clara heard Storm before she saw him, his low whine cutting through the mechanical hum of ventilation. When their eyes met through the bars, Clara's hands trembled with rage. Her beautiful, proud wolf was muzzled and heavily sedated. "You don't belong here," she whispered, fingers working quickly at the electronic lock with the keycard they'd stolen. "None of you do." The sound of approaching footsteps sent her ducking behind a support column. 2 auction assistants walked past, discussing lot numbers. Clara waited until their voices faded before continuing her work. Above, the auction was beginning. Clara could hear the auctioneer's voice through the ventilation system as she moved from cage to cage, systematically disabling locks. Her hands were steady now, driven by purpose rather than fear. The first howl shattered the carefully orchestrated atmosphere of wealth and refinement. Storm, shaking off sedation, led the charge as cages burst open. Exotic cats, wolves, and other creatures poured through the facility's corridors, seeking freedom. Chaos erupted upstairs. Clara heard screams, breaking glass, the thunder of running feet. She smiled grimly, knowing Shadow would be making his way inside during the confusion. "You!" Clara spun to find Garrick blocking the stairwell, his face twisted with fury. The gun in his hand gleamed dully in the emergency lights. "Did you really think you could destroy everything I've built?" He snarled, advancing. "A stupid little girl playing hero." Clara backed away, her mind racing. "You built nothing," she shot back. "You just hurt and destroyed. That's all you know how to do. And now I'm going to destroy you." Garrick raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. 2 grey blurs exploded from the shadows. Storm and Shadow moved as one, their massive bodies carrying Garrick to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor as the wolves, creatures he had once deemed worthless, brought down the man who had sentenced them to death. Clara watched, heart in her throat, as her wolves held Garrick pinned, their golden eyes gleaming with righteous fury. Above them, sirens wailed and boots thundered on marble as law enforcement finally arrived. "They were never worthless," Clara said quietly, looking down at Garrick's terrified face. "You just didn't know their true value." The wolves maintained their hold until officers swarmed the facility, weapons drawn. Only at Clara's gentle command did they release their former tormentor, moving to flank her protectively as Garrick was cuffed and led away. Through the mansion's broken windows, dawn painted the Montana sky in gentle pinks and golds. Clara sat on the marble steps, a wolf on either side of her, watching as police cars and animal control vehicles crowded the circular driveway. Her father's old pickup truck stood out among the official vehicles, its rusty frame a reminder of the simple life she'd left behind just hours ago. Storm rested his massive head on her lap while Shadow kept alert, golden eyes tracking every movement of the officers securing the scene. Clara's fingers traced the healing cuts on Storm's muzzle from his time in captivity, her touch gentle against his thick fur. "Miss Whitlow?" A detective approached, keeping a respectful distance from the wolves. "We'll need your full statement, but I wanted you to know. The evidence you and Mr. Kettering gathered combined with what we found tonight, Garrick's going away for a long time." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She watched as officers led a parade of Garrick's associates out in handcuffs, the men who'd burned her family's barn, the handlers who'd brutalized Storm, the corrupt officials who'd looked the other way. Their power seemed so small now in the morning light. "Clara!" Dean jogged up the steps, his server's uniform dusty and torn. He'd spent the last hour helping Animal Control identify and document the exotic creatures they'd freed. "You okay?" "I think I am," she said, surprising herself with how true it felt. "Actually, I know I am." Dean settled beside her, careful to leave space for Shadow. "You know, when I first saw you with these two, I thought you were crazy brave. Taking in wolves, standing up to everyone who said you couldn't do it." He shook his head, smiling. "But that wasn't even the half of it." Clara laughed softly. "I was terrified most of the time. Even tonight. My hands wouldn't stop shaking until I saw Storm in that cage. Then everything just cleared up, like I finally knew exactly who I was supposed to be. And who's that?" She considered the question, watching as the first news vans began arriving. Soon her quiet life would become very public. The teenage girl who exposed a criminal empire, who saved endangered animals, who proved that courage comes in all sizes. "Someone who protects what matters," she said finally. "Someone who doesn't back down just because people say I should." Storm lifted his head, meeting her gaze with intelligent eyes. "These two taught me that. Everyone said they were dangerous, worthless, too wild to save. But they just needed someone to believe in them." Dean's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Like someone believed in you." "Maybe." Clara smiled, remembering all the times she'd felt small and voiceless. "Or maybe they helped me believe in myself." The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and prairie grass, reminding Clara of those first days with the wolves. She'd been so afraid then, of failing them, of being wrong, of standing out. Now she sat transformed, her wolves beside her, knowing her own strength. A familiar truck engine rumbled up the drive. Clara's father stepped out, his weathered face a mix of worry and pride. The wolves tensed slightly but remained calm as he approached. "Got a call from Sheriff Barnes," he said, sitting heavily on the step. "Told me my daughter just helped bring down Raymond Garrick." He shook his head, looking at Clara with new eyes. "Guess I was wrong about a lot of things." Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the rough fabric of his work shirt. "We all were. About the wolves, about me, about what we're capable of." "These two," her father gestured to Storm and Shadow, "they're not just pets, are they? Never were." "No," Clara agreed. "They're protectors. Always have been." She scratched behind Storm's ears, remembering the trembling puppies she'd found on that back road. "We protect each other." The sun climbed higher, warming the cold marble steps. Clara watched as wildlife officials began coordinating homes for Garrick's rescued animals, legitimate sanctuaries and reserves where they would be valued, not exploited. Her wolves would stay with her, their bond too deep to sever. "You know what this means, don't you?" Dean asked, breaking her reverie. "You're going to have to stop calling yourself the quiet Whitlow girl." Clara laughed, the sound bright and free. "I don't think anyone's going to make that mistake again." Storm and Shadow stood in unison, stretching their powerful bodies in the morning light. They were no longer symbols of weakness or fear. They were magnificent creatures who had chosen to stand with her, to fight beside her, to show her that being underestimated didn't mean being powerless. Clara rose too, feeling the weight of the night's events in her tired muscles. But her spirit felt lighter than ever, unburdened by doubt and strengthened by victory. She had faced down monsters and won. She had given voice to the voiceless. She had become someone she never dreamed she could be. "Let's go home," she said to her wolves, to Dean, to her father. "There's a lot of work still to do." The wolves fell into step beside her as they descended the mansion steps, their presence both gentle and fierce, just like the girl who had saved them, who they had saved in return. Clara walked tall between them, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. She had found her place in the world, standing up for what was right, protecting those who needed protection, and she would never back down again. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.